Today I'm putting out a huge video for me. It is the longest script that I've written at over 40,000 words, a runtime that's going to exceed an hour. I've spent the last 10 days of my life doing almost nothing else, which only goes to prove that, frankly, I'm as shitty at being retired as I am at working. But it isn't totally my fault. This project is the result of an intrusive thought put in my head by the Leopard Society, who suggested that he would like to hear some real advice, as opposed to more lefty criticisms of the world. But why so long? Well, because I went deep into a rabbit hole when I started researching the topics of small communities and what potential they held for our future. Like many of you, I was vaguely aware of the 60s era hippie communes and the Israeli agricultural communes, but I never really took them all that seriously. I thought they were experiments that simply stayed on the fringe, that they didn't really work that well. That all changed once I started to take a serious look at the topic. And what I found made me a convert. I have become hopelessly obsessed with the intentional community movement. So I'm going to share with you what I found, try and put it into some sort of order and an argument, bring in some of the theory, then a documentary section that describes the benefits and some of the challenges of living in that way, then wrapping it all up with some other things to consider and a conclusion. If you'd like to skip past the theory section and jump on to the more documentary part of the video, I will put timestamps in the show notes to make that easy for you. But now, I think I need to change into my preacher outfit. Dear brothers and sisters in Marx, I've come to you to share the good news. Salvation is at hand. Our precious Lord has made his plan clear and manifest on the YouTubes and the interwebs. He is calling upon all of us to share in his mercy. He is calling upon us to immerse ourselves in the sanctifying waters of holy community. He's calling upon us to put down our worldly burdens and give up our materialism and join us in matrimony to sanctified community. Don't fret, brother. The way has already been shown to us by the Lord's prophets, whose Birkenstock-clad feet have pounded a clear path for us to follow. They've already cultivated the organic garden and filled the rechargeable batteries with renewable energy. They have a bunk ready for you in the glorious kingdom of cooperative living. Get ready to feast on homemade granola and certified organic kale. Enrich your body and your soul at our group meals. Prepare yourself to share this bounty. We found the way, so now let's show our less fortunate brothers so they can share in our righteousness and follow the glowing path of intentional community. In this video, I'm going to present my own thoughts based on 52 years of observations and based on the reading I've done so far. To be completely honest, I kind of expect that these thoughts will continue to evolve as long as I continue to work on them. Frankly, I don't believe in utopia. In fact, believe that utopia, as we conceive of it, is not something that humans could really reasonably appreciate. I was tempted to include some comments about John Calhoun and his experiments with the quote-unquote perfect mouse colonies and the resulting disasters, but ultimately his conclusions about overpopulation and bad behavior that come from putting rodents into a perfect environment aren't without controversy, and they don't necessarily mean that a perfect world would lead to bad outcomes for humans. But I do think that our biology is key to our humanity, and it is likely that we would do well in a world where there are always challenges. Our species evolved under pressure. My aim is to create a better lifestyle, a happier, freer, and more satisfying life, but not a perfect one. Staying what I think is a workable alternative lifestyle and making that attractive enough that it gets people talking and thinking more seriously about these type of alternatives. I also believe that we cannot afford to be concerned and not act. There is evidence that climate change is accelerating. The World Meteorological Organization has released a report in 2021, I believe, have to confirm that, indicating that there's a 90% chance that the next 5 years will be the hottest on record, and that there is a 44% chance that we will see 1 year in the upcoming 5 to be 1.5 C hotter than the pre-industrial average. Why does 1.5 C matter? Because that is a figure that the Paris Climate Accord specifically identified to avoid. NASA describes our situation as follows, quote, "The current warming trend is of particular significance because it is unequivocally the result of human activity since the mid-20th century and proceeding at a rate that is unprecedented over millennia. It is undeniable that human activities have warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land, and that widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred. A review of extreme weather in 2021 brings up a list of well-researched reports of increasingly unpredictable and disastrous weather." Basically, if you're alive and you read anything other than certain right-wing news sources, you have to reach the conclusion that the world's climate seems to be changing rapidly and dangerously. To sit by and do nothing becomes an increasingly untenable, if not downright despicable option. Each and every one of us needs to act to change the human activities that have caused our current mess. But let's say you don't accept what the majority of the scientific community is agreed on. Let's say that you don't trust academics, or that you believe that God manages the weather, or that you have your own beliefs based on your research from some obscure website and, I don't know, Ouija boards. What then? Is there no reason for you to consider another way of life? How about species extinction? I'd assume that most of us would be concerned about wildlife and plants going extinct. If nothing else, it makes the world a bit uglier and less interesting. How about pollution and waste? Can you look at polluted oceans, polluted beaches, rivers, forests, cities, and towns and feel nothing? Doesn't it bother you, at least aesthetically? It's pretty ugly. It is probably causing degradation to our food supply. It does seem to be accumulating in a way that cleanup is going to be horribly expensive and difficult. Even if you don't think that extinction, pollution, and resource shortages are a huge issue, taken together, we can all agree that the world would be healthier, prettier, and safer if we could all become more efficient, more cautious, consume less, and get more out of what we do consume. So let's put aside the tree-hugging stuff for a second, and let's talk economics. Is there other reasons why our current level of consumption is unsustainable? There is certainly a lot of concern about the levels of personal and government debt, and these burdens suggest that many of us are living beyond our means, especially as debt growth is exceeding inflation. As consumer spending is so critical to economic growth, many economists would argue that debt is healthy as it reaps economic growth, and economic growth creates wealth to pay off the debt. That may be true, but the more debt as a portion of income increases, the greater the risk that consumption might be constrained. In times of downturn, a heavily indebted consumer doesn't have the ability to continue to grow spending. At some point, the credit has to come to an end. This can have a debilitating knock-on effect where downturn gets worse as consumers also have to cut spending in order to service existing debt. If consumer debt isn't your concern, what about government debt? Government debt has grown at unprecedented rates, driven by COVID. The OECD makes its usual very understated comment, quote, "Prudent debt management will be required as financing needs for debt repayment soar and the outlook for the global economy remains uncertain," close quote. The optimist among us would say, well, no problem. A crisis drove that borrowing, as it should, and as things return to normal, governments can pay back. Besides, nation states exist for long periods, so even if governments only service debts, then as GDP grows, it becomes less of a problem. This, of course, ignores a lot of assumptions, such as permanent economic growth. Is that a foregone conclusion? And then what if we end up in a situation where there are more crises closely following on COVID? Let's say extreme weather disasters. As debt grows, government's ability to stabilize the economy weakens and pressure on society increases. Our demands on government spending also need to be moderated. So, long story short, or perhaps long story long, change is needed. We can all agree on that. My take on the direction of change is to recommend one that de-escalates the pressure on our world. Less consumption, less spending, less production, more efficiency, greater caution in everything we do. And I don't frankly see why sustainability isn't within our grasp. After all, we've existed as a species for many tens of thousands of years. We know we can live within the resources of the planet. We know we can exist without destroying our environment. We know we can live within our means. Frankly, we don't really have much of a choice. Most of the issues I've outlined have the ability to force change upon us. Despite what the fundamentalist right might hold as the gospel truth, our control today is going to be limited to time and to circumstances only. We have a choice between acting deliberately and quickly or delaying acting later and being driven by pure survival. So those of you who have watched my Ivan Illich videos know that he would be in favor of reducing consumption dramatically, as he believed the biggest issue in our modern world was one of scale. Any tool that became too large and too complicated eventually became counterproductive to its objectives. What I haven't discussed before is that he isn't alone in these thoughts. Thinkers like E.F. Schumacher, Leopold Kohr, both political ecologists and economists argued that small scales were always better. And by the way, I've started to read Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful, or one of his books, Small is Beautiful, and I can't recommend it enough. It's absolutely a great read. I don't agree with everything he says. He makes some statements very strongly that I don't love. But in general, it's a fantastic book, and it really makes his points super clear. Let's flip this all around. Let's talk about some positive reasons to change your lifestyles. Are there any? I have to say with absolutely great commitment, fucking right there are reasons. So let's start with human needs and aspirations. Firstly, this is an issue of becoming fully conscious, responsible, and autonomous human being. Becoming is a critical part of human development. Emotionally significant developments, like having a purpose, are dependent on becoming a full adult. Our modern world has significantly disrupted this perfectly human development and made truly meaningful adult autonomy much more difficult to attain. Practically every book I've read in the past few months has referred to the infantilization of modern humans in our current system. For instance, Lynn Chancer, talking about BDSM-like relationships at work, mentions that interpersonal relations of dominance and submission put workers in a position that is submissive and slave-like and strips people of their autonomy. David Graeber, in his book Bullshit Jobs, expands into great detail on how the medieval apprentice system specifically managed the transition of adolescents into autonomous adults. Unlike our modern society that forces us into jobs that are totally dependent on our employer to dictate how we live, and that situation exists for the majority of our lives. Both of these trends strip us of a chance to emerge as fully formed adults. And of course, Illich criticizes the modern world in a similar way. My own experience, my sense that my autonomy was always a lie, my feelings of inadequacy, my sense of being small and ineffective, all confirm on a subjective level that these thinkers are pointing to a real phenomenon. Making a change is our opportunity to take agency back and become a fully adult human. We also, as I've talked about a lot of times, but most specifically in my first video, are being sold an illusion that leaves far too many of us suffering from depression, anxiety, and low self-esteem. And I'm not being radical here. The U.S. National Institute of Health published a study that concludes, quote, "More money does not lead to more happiness by appealing to evolutionary proclivities like a desire for energy-dense food and status competition. The economic and marketing forces of modern society have engineered an environment promoting decisions that maximize consumption at the long-term cost of well-being," close quote. So there is evidence that suggests that not only is our current way of life unsustainable, but we also aren't really enjoying it. So making a change is our opportunity to live happier, simpler, and more sustainable lives. Consciously changing our way of life gives us a chance to begin rebuilding true communities, social needs of humans, and the necessity of human interdependence is extremely well understood. We cannot live without others. Our brains are dependent on a social life. We will emotionally and possibly physically wither if we are denied healthy, meaningful communities. This is driven by the simple reason that our brains are wired to connect. And in my endnotes, I do link some resources if you want to read more about how it is that the human brains are wired in such a way that we're absolutely dependent on having healthy communities and healthy relationships. All of my reading is consistent. Modern society is terrible at building human connection and community. I speak about loneliness and a sense of alienation that came with my job. Filling my social needs through professional relationships wasn't successful. Illich points out that specialization coming from modern production methods forces separation through creating differences between people. And these differences are based on profession, they're based on education, they're based on class, they're based on experience. But the end result being that we are physically, culturally, and systemically separated, or at least told we're separate from other people. But all's not lost. All of these pressures can be addressed. They can be addressed by making conscious changes led by groups of people who are motivated to live and work together. While a mass conversion of our current system and society is extremely difficult to achieve, there are many people who want to live differently badly enough to join you in a community-based experiment. Small is beautiful, living in more conscious communities. I believe that promoting small communities as the primary social organization structure, the primary polity in our world, is one of the ideas from Ivan Illich that I find most compelling. Effectively, Illich's idea is that small is a better formula for human life than trying to establish large, complicated structures. His thesis is based around the idea that any tool, whether that be a factory, whether that be a machine, or whether that be an organization, an institution, once it becomes sufficiently complicated, technical, and built on a really large scale, it will begin to give results that are counterproductive to the objective of which it was built for. If we look at the work of Robin Dunbar, He sets the number of an ideal community at a maximum of approximately 150 people. This is the maximum number of people that an individual human being could reasonably form stable relationships with. This number is limited by the capacity of our brains. Dunbar investigated 21 hunter-gatherer groups and found that the average number in a group was 148. This number also pops up in military fighting units that are usually kept below 200 people and in Hutterite communities that are split once they reach a size of 150. Here's where I think smaller groups are always better than larger groups, or easier to manage, certainly, than larger groups. If we look at distributory and participatory justice, if we're going to build a society that is more humane than our current one, then the key moral and psychological issues we are going to have to deal with is allowing everyone in that community to have equal access to resources and an ability to participate in the running of that community. If there are too many people, then direct democracy begins to become extremely hard to manage. As the community grows, as it becomes bigger, it becomes more and more efficient and easier to move to some type of representative democracy, which is exactly what we have in democratic countries currently. But having an elected politician governing us is not really effective participation. Obviously, a representative will never be able to accurately reflect the views and interests of everyone that he or she represents. Whereas in a sufficiently small community, it is possible to hold government meetings with every community member in attendance, or through other means, offer everyone the opportunity to participate directly. Moreover, it becomes much easier to understand and appreciate the contribution of everyone to the success of that community. In our current large cities and towns, it's easy to ignore and misunderstand our neighbors. This lack of relationship makes it easier to seek pure self-interest in political processes because we don't know or necessarily see government decisions affect individuals. In a smaller community, knowing the impact of decisions is easy. It's unavoidable because you know everyone who's part of the community. I'm also thinking about the free rider problem that exists in human societies. I mean, this is one of the favorite ones that comes up whenever we discuss socialist or communist politics, that the right-wing free market type will say, yeah, but you have to have incentives to work. And I think from their perspective, that's not completely wrong. I mean, we've all had the experience of a team member at school or at work or whatever who didn't pull their own weight. And I think it's fair to say that this tendency affects a sizable minority of people, even if it's not a universal behavior. But I would argue that it is much easier and more prevalent in a large community where anonymity assists individuals in shirking their responsibility. In a smaller community, this type of behavior is much easier to spot and to address. It'd still happen. It's a human behavior. Everyone doesn't show up at work every day feeling good, and so on and so on and so on. And then certain people just, for whatever reason, and there may be an important reason, but for whatever reason, don't like to contribute as much as others, or don't seem to be motivated to contribute as much as others. But in a smaller community, community rules or community constitutions could provide incentives to avoid this kind of behavior and penalties for people where this behavior becomes problematic. I'd also add to this that based on the research I've been doing, giving people back their sense of involvement, choice, and responsibility seems to result in less likelihood of individuals shirking work. It seems that our current systems, with its disincentives to laziness, like starvation, don't actually motivate people. What they do is create fear, they create resentment, and they create a desire to cheat. You put people in a nourishing, freer, and more inclusive group, and suddenly some of these tendencies simply go away, even if not all. There is a limited need to develop professional governance, or to develop bureaucracy, or to develop rigid rules in a small community. A small community can meet regularly and can agree together on governing issues. So when new problems arise, it's not overly difficult to adjust practice or policy in order to address an issue. I think this is much more humane than in a large organization that depends on standardized rules to deal with problems. Human beings are just not simple, predictable, and stable like machines are. So to have a community that was humane, it is necessary to keep some flexibility and adaptability. Again, exception to rules can be managed in a small group much easier than in a large group. Corruption and other forms of system abuse are easier to justify in a large group where any damage done is spread across a lot of people. Smaller groups are going to notice issues much quicker because even small problems are borne by fewer individuals. Moreover, because of the size of the community, social pressure to not abuse your neighbors is much more intense. So it's a trope, but I can say with confidence, in small communities, it's really hard to keep secrets. Because it's hard to keep secrets, you can deal with problems earlier and quicker. And because it's a small community, you can deal with them face to face. And because it's a small community, you can come to solutions that fit a problem rather than trying to force everyone into behaving in the same way. Finally, why is small good? Because I think it really is the best answer to the question of sustainability. So Illich's guidance is that large organizations, large machines, large systems create large problems. And these large problems are dependent on a few experts with insight, with access, and with the capabilities to fix. So you've got big problems faced by a few people. But if we think about a small community, with smaller organizations, smaller machines, and smaller systems, it's far easier for the average person to understand. You have more people involved in trying to fix. And as a result, the problems are just going to be easier to manage. So if you take any currently constituted country, but certainly a big Western European style democracy, they have massive systems around them. They have massive bureaucracies. They have very large and cumbersome and complicated governments. Every one of us, when faced with big problems, then say, well, what am I going to do about it? Well, let's get our government to do something about it. The problem there is getting this massive organization to move, which, frankly speaking, is going to be incredibly difficult just to do with bureaucratic momentum. But then on top of that, the number of pressures, the number of complications, the number of different competing ideas that are all coming at that system are going to make finding a simple, easy solution also difficult to achieve. Finally, when you have really huge electrical systems, when you have massive infrastructure costing billions of dollars, every change that you make can have huge impacts. It can have huge costs. The problems that are coming out of those systems also can be really, really difficult to fix. Now, if we turn and we look at intentional communities, and I've spent quite a bit of time doing research in the last little while about recently formed intentional communities. And what I've found is that for the vast majority of them, they talk about sustainability. And if they aren't talking about becoming fully sustainable and self-sufficient, then they're at least concerned with economizing and minimizing waste. In that case, these communities are coming up with relatively small, not always simple, but relatively small ways of, say, generating power, having a local sustainable grid. These smaller organizations, machines, and systems are simply easier to understand and easier to manage. Everyone in that community can at least discuss and brainstorm on a solution, if not be actively involved in fixing the problems. So from Illich's perspective, and I tend to agree with him on this, the biggest problem with our current world is that no person, no community, no country, and in fact no single group of countries can solve the environmental crisis we face because there's a problem of powerlessness and widely distributed responsibility. The absolute flip side of that is a small community that can act on their responsibilities because they have the power to change it. Is this a realistic proposition? These small communities already exist and take on many forms. In general, the spectrum runs from co-living projects where people cooperate in housing and establish a community where housing is both separate spaces and communal spaces. These communities may also cooperate around life chores and share certain resources. The key feature of co-living is sharing housing infrastructure to reduce cost borne by individuals.
Communal meals are a staple at Capitalism, where 71 people live in 28 houses, clustered around shared recreational and outdoor spaces, walkways, gardens, and parking, and a common house. Residents are expected to clean shared areas and take turns tending the grounds. Everyone shares resources like laundry facilities, outdoor tools, and play equipment. Small groups of families rotate leading monthly community meetings.
You live in kind of a small village. You know everybody around you, and you share as much as possible. So you are a very close neighbor, and you're kind of depending on each other, but you're not obligated to any strict rules.
Every family has privacy in a home with its own bedrooms, baths, and kitchen. The land is cooperatively owned, but residents own their homes, a structure similar to a condominium association in the U.S. Capitalism started 46 years ago and is recognized as the first co-housing community in the world.
It's a collection of individual homes built around common spaces where people eat together, make shared decisions, and share an ethos of living simply, sustainably, and in support of one another. Co-housing is just one point on a wide spectrum of communal living models, and it's basically built on three principles: shared space, shared time, and shared values.
At the other end of the spectrum is the self-sufficient commune, where everything in the community is shared and there is limited private property.
Twin Oaks was founded in 1967. Twin Oaks is an income-sharing community, which is kind of like 100% taxation. When you move in, you still keep all your assets and debt as your own. Then once you arrive, you work around 40 hours a week, both at Twin Oaks and sometimes neighboring communities. And in return, you get everything: food, housing, healthcare, even a small monthly allowance to spend on things like booze, smokes, and chocolate.
Both of these types of arrangements have existed for a long time, and there seems to be a resurgence of interest, driven by rising costs, environmental concerns, and rejection of capitalism. Benefits of this type of community. A small community could absorb many individual responsibilities into the group's shared responsibility. For instance, anyone who has ever cooked knows that it is usually as easy to cook for a group as it is to cook just for yourself.
Co-housing experts will tell you that the shared meal is the secret sauce of building community. Most groups gather 1 to 3 times a week for a casual meal. In my community, I serve on kitchen duty once every 3 months, but every single Sunday I get to just show up for a hot meal, hang out with my neighbors, and pass my toddler from lap to lap.
Similar advantages would exist in shopping, cleaning, childcare, and maintenance. Sharing every task where effort expended wasn't positively correlated to the number of people would reduce total effort necessary. The benefits of this would be myriad. Currently, in the developed world, the majority of regular responsibilities are borne by individuals. So working to make money, providing and maintaining housing, sourcing healthcare, managing children's education, maintaining transportation, grocery shopping, and on are all the responsibility of 1 or 2 adults in each household. This is both highly stressful and extremely inefficient. Communities provide a way to share these tasks, making everyone's life easier.
Community dinners and potluck, and so I just like having all that. I mean, things that would have taken before, The effort that we would have had to put into something like that before, like to go sing songs for an hour and a half on a Wednesday night at 7:30, impossible.
Everyone participates in this community in a lot of different ways. I'm the meter reader and accountant for our local internal power grid. I am the bookkeeper for the Dancing Rabbit Vehicle Co-op. I'm the accountant for our mothership of all co-ops. I am the administrator for the land trust that administers all the leaseholds and deals with the management of the land itself that the nonprofit is located at. I'm on the process team, which helps committees get their proposals through group process. And I've recently been elected to my first term on the village council.
As well, having people stay at home to manage domestic tasks is very hard for the modern couple, as living expenses are often too expensive to cover with a single salary. But a group of people can more easily support domestic workers. The burden is the same, but the individual costs are much smaller. Shared labor comes up repeatedly as a reason why people love these places. The ability to tap into the skills and energy of their neighbors is a huge benefit. Not only effort reduction, but time being freed up and resources pooled to achieve goals that an individual couldn't. This area is most commonly discussed in communities formed around shared interests. So village gardens, environmental projects from water usage to energy usage. In the more intensively communal groups, there may be a shared business. Some of the longest lasting and most successful communities have formed around businesses. These businesses add a whole new layer of activity to the community. A business can replace outside work, bringing income generation into the community and allowing the community to become much more self-sustaining.
Keenan is free to work however and whenever he pleases because the community actually makes good money. They generate $600,000 a year in profit from what have to be the most stereotypical commune businesses you could imagine: tofu and hammocks. Where do you sell the tofu?
We sell the tofu to universities and to Whole Foods.
So to major buyers.
Yeah, apparently Whole Foods is going to start lowering their prices. So,
Are you worried about that?
Well, then we can't sell our tofu for as much.
So you're not immune to the shocks of the market?
Indeed not.
For over 30 years, residents at Twin Oaks produced every hammock sold in Pier 1 imports, Kirstie Alley's favorite purveyor of reasonably priced bedazzled pillows. They no longer work with Pier 1. The demand was too great for their small labor force, but they still produce hammocks that go for upwards of $120 a pop.
Members may very rarely ever need to leave. A holistic community can provide so much of a member's needs and wants. Another big role for this type of community is allowing mutually interested groups to strive for shared goals. Growing your own food is very popular. Some groups have an overt political view and try to put those into practice in the community. I note one of the oldest secular communities in the US is explicitly egalitarian.
It's hard to locate Twin Oaks philosophically because we operate as a communistic organization. You know, we're sort of a pure sort of communism. However, the way we function is that we are not trying to keep people here and that they can't leave. We have a waiting list of people who want to join, and the only consequence we have for people who don't work their share is they get kicked out. So this sort of small-scale communism works really well.
Religion has been an important historical cause of these communities' formation, but in my research I came across relatively few new communities of this type. Not sure if this is indicative of a trend, my search methods, or if there is simply a desire to keep these communities private. Another benefit repeatedly voiced as positive about these villages is social. People talk about less loneliness and a sense of connection to something. They talk about friendships. They talk about a sense of being supported, accepted, and being loved. They talk about how easy being sociable is and how each community provides something they felt they were missing in the regular world. Sociability comes up as a key objective sought when forming or joining a community.
The reason why I can look at my brothers and my sisters with heartfelt love is because they have seen me in my absolute worst. They have seen me rage. They have seen me cry. They have witnessed me fighting with my husband. They have witnessed me fail. And that's something that we don't really get in society to do. I am loved because somebody has loved me through my ugliness.
There are frequent comments about escaping the isolating and alienating nature of the modern world.
What brought me to Dancing Rabbit initially was a sense of swimming against the current in our mainstream culture. I really noticed the difference of being in a group of people who were really doing something together, being self-aware, communicating clearly, setting boundaries clearly, and treating everyone with the same kind of respect that you want for yourself. It was powerful. When we left after the visitor program and went back home, go away for 2-3 weeks, it always feels good to come home. This was the first time in my life where I did not have that it's good to be home experience. It felt empty.
A frequently cited benefit is also child rearing. Children often put heavy demands on a modern parent, especially one trying to balance work and parenting. Members of these communities discuss how parenting and socializing children is often shared. In communities where there are elderly and young children, there develops pairing similar to a multi-generational home. Older people step into part-time parenting roles and benefit from having something sociable and challenging in their life.
My favorite thing about co-housing is the sharing of wisdom and support across the generations. My community ranges in age from 1 to 80, and the best connections happen between individuals at opposite ends of the spectrum. My daughter learned to walk while holding the walker of one of her many adoring aunties. It's the village that I'd always imagined.
Parents appreciate the unparalleled opportunities for children as well. A community with several children allow for casual, easy, and safe friendships. Often these children are afforded greater freedom just because of the space and constant occupation of these villages. Children can run around in an area possibly larger than the usual suburban home, accompanied by other children, but left to unstructured time because there are always adults around to keep a casual eye on what is going on.
It's a pretty amazing place to be a family, in that we both work out of our homes. We both work here at Dancing Rabbit. I have to leave for births, but I'm not gone much. So we're with Zane all the time, we're together all the time, and then he has this wider community of adults and kids that care about him and look out for him and play with him and interact with him regularly, and it's pretty amazing. I think our lives outside of here, I don't think our family would feel as connected and strong.
Finally, child-rearing projects like homeschooling are simply too time-consuming and labor-intensive for individual parents, but some of these groups are able to take on these types of projects as well.
Or do as I'm doing, follow me.
Before I moved to Twin Oaks, I actually was an elementary school teacher. I have my master's degree in elementary education. And I wasn't very happy with the options available to me teaching in public schools or private schools elsewhere, because I would always be working with 20 or 30 kids, and you just can't get to know each kid that well, and you can't tailor the curriculum, and you never get to know their parents. and things like that. And you can't follow them. You know, I would have a kid in my class one year and then they'd be gone and I'd never see them again.
Radek, how's your drawing coming? Do you remember how to make a snowflake, Anya?
I'm the green foot.
Oh, okay.
But here at Twin Oaks, the kids are here as long as their parents live here, and I'll be able to work with them as babies and work with them as toddlers and teach them history when they get older.
Do you have a cell phone?
What are you doing today?
Well, I'm gonna work unicorn school, and then I'm gonna clean the kettle. And then I might pick out my party outfit. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds fun.
The mutual nature of these associations allows for expression of alternative lifestyles. A sampling of these communities shows a lot of variability and the expression of non-conforming lifestyles. These smaller communities of mutual interest seem to provide the protection necessary to allow individuals within the community to live insulated from the outside world.
What is like dating and sex like in a commune?
I think there's a lot less focus on monogamy in the commune than there is definitely in the like mainstream, which is actually another reason that I wanted to live here, because I think there's a lot of problems with monogamy.
What else? We do heart circles. We care about heart connection. We do, greater awesomeness. Greater awesomeness is part of Cambia. So we encourage people's passions. We encourage people to pursue their passions. We have weekly check-ins. We hold people accountable for their passions.
Obnoxiously weird about Cambia is that we live in very bizarre dwellings. We prioritize funky, crazy, creative things. We actually work not that much for actual like money or on site, and we focus more on personal growth. Cambia is also extremely focused on cuddles. We have a big cuddle puddle infrastructure in the middle of our house. Yes. Nobody really knows exactly why, but it just sort of evolved.
Do we have a question?
Yeah, what's ARE?
It stands for the Association for Research and Enlightenment, which was started by a man named Edgar Cayce in the 30s and 40s. He was a psychic, so they say, and his organization studies mysticism and New Age things. They started the camp, but the camp is more of a communal experience.
Yeah, the thing I find really valuable about camp is that it allows for really pure and raw avenues of expression. So, like, even on staff as an adult, I feel like in a lot of ways I can express myself creatively as though I were a little kid. So that kind of dimension of myself can come to the surface, and because there are a lot of kids around and because there are a lot of adults trying to create a good space for kids, it creates a container in which this kind of expression is very welcome.
Illich, again, seems to have been right when he asserted that this model would result in supporting diversity. Whereas large organizations, cities, nations, strive to enact a single vision of citizenship, smaller, voluntary villages would allow people to choose the mode of life that best suited them. I personally love the idea of segregating all golfers into a single high-walled estate and preferably keeping them completely out of view. One of the biggest benefits I saw in researching these communities was the tremendous amount of security that these types of communities could provide. From the simple, a neighbor close by who could help you in time of need, to the all-encompassing communities that provide healthcare, insurance, and casual or even sometimes formal mental support.
On a quarterly basis, 4 times a year, we invite somebody to come and uncover our shit. Even if we don't know it's there. We have to take personal ownership over our relations. We've had people come in with, nonviolent communication. We've had family marriage therapists come in. We've had people come and teach us holographic models. We've had people come in and teach us the Enneagram. We've had people come in, and we're constantly giving and giving and giving to ourselves so that we can show up as better people in our community. And that is something that every person, even if you don't live in a community, you have to do. Why? Because we live in a world right now where we can say things like friend, unfriend, swipe, I'm done. Follow, unfollow, black and white. It's superficial. And there's somebody, and not somebody, there's something that is greatly impacted by that. And that is our future.
This benefit is extremely attractive in countries with poor social safety nets. But even in relatively progressive countries, large bureaucratic benefits can be extremely difficult to access for many people. Communities can bridge that gap. When we talk about finding greater freedom from modern society, capitalism, and from modern work, I think this is where international communities can shine. In a well-established community, a few members losing their income becomes much easier to accommodate. They could be both supported and in exchange support the community in other ways. No one in this type of community would need to put up with excessive exploitation due to dependence, and power imbalances in capitalism could be partially mediated.
We have to pay taxes. We have to pay health care. It's because we can't live in a microcosm. This ain't a spaceship, and we're not in it by ourselves.
Jeremiah, one of Eastwind's ranch managers, has worked these pastures for the past 6 years. He used to work for a chemical company, but after being laid off twice, he decided to pursue his passion for raising animals.
I just figured I'd try something a little kooky and crazy, have a little last adventure, and found out about communities still existing, came here and fell in love and haven't left yet. I love it, it's great, and I've really grown a lot being here. I've come to, every day you learn something new. I've been here over 7 years, and I'm just starting to have a clue. But I've never been so happy.
These communities are all alternative, and I mean that in the quote-unquote not normal way. There exists prejudice and biases about them. So in the research I've done, frequent mentions are made about these prejudices. Hippies and cults are the immediate association.
The moment somebody learns that I live in an intentional community, I open myself up to some very interesting questions. Question number 1. So, how many husbands do you really have? Question number 2, who here is the leader? I've even had somebody come up to me at one point and say, are you able to leave? Just blink if you need my help and I'll come get you.
And people say, oh, well, so you just live in poverty out in the woods. I'm like, yeah, except you don't have 1,000 acres of land to run around in. You don't have a creek in your backyard. You can't walk around on your streets at night. You don't even have health care. You don't have job security. You can't just go learn a new skill because you want to. That's a kind of wealth.
Some might call us a hippie commune. And it is true that Eastwind's origins are intertwined with the counterculture movement of the 60s. But we prefer to call ourselves, quite simply, an income-sharing community. And in fact, most of us wouldn't consider ourselves to be hippies.
Probably identify more with being a hillbilly than a hippie.
I don't know. I never have really. I don't know what a hippie is. It's just sort of a stereotype. And I'm not a stereotype, I think for myself.
I don't think it's useful to filter my actions through a pre-decided persona. I think if I called myself a hippie, then I would have to do things that a hippie does and wear clothes that a hippie wears, and that's not conducive to personal growth.
I don't know. I don't think I really even know what a hippie is. My mama makes jokes and says that my son is the first black hippie, but I don't know.
I think people throw around that term in reference to people who wear certain clothing or like being close to the earth. I do love wearing tie-dye. I do love the Grateful Dead. I do love gardening. I do love doing yoga. I mean, I don't know. I'm a human being.
So joining this type of community may mean having to put up with the judgment of family, friends, and the general public. Setting up an intentional community will require a lot of deliberate planning. You could move to one that's already existing, but unfortunately this isn't necessarily easy. If you don't live in North America, Australia, or Europe, there are very few of these types of villages. Where I currently live in South Africa, there are none. The closest I could find was Zambia, which is more than 2,000 kilometers away. From next year, when I return to my home in Canada, there are a few communities in my area, but all of them are either not yet established, unsuitable, or closed to new residents. If you decide that you'd like to set up your own community, then you have a huge number of hurdles to jump. First, you're going to need members, and finding and selecting a workable group is not necessarily going to be easy.
Now, co-housing is not for everyone. Some may find it invasive or manufactured or just too much togetherness.
Suitable, like-minded citizens of your group obviously is incredibly important. After all, these people are going to be family, and we know how badly that can go.
So in addition to shared space and shared time, we enter a community with a shared commitment to valuing each individual.
In addition, setting up isn't going to be free. You will need working capital to buy or rent land. You'll need a lawyer to help negotiate the process of making your community stable and sustainable within the capitalist legal structure of your country.
But we had two things in common. Number one, we are absolutely 100% committed to improving our mind, our body, our spirit, and pushing ourselves to become better humans. And number two, we have no issues in calling attorneys to write up proper agreements.
In the show notes, I will make a link of resources, some of which are for sale, other of which are free. But one of the things to keep in mind is that many existing property laws aren't conducive to this type of arrangement, and legal representation may become a necessity during the setting up process. What are your core beliefs? How do you want to make decisions? What are the rights and responsibilities to belong to your village? Managing and ownership of shared resources. All of these items will need to be decided.
In the early days, the days of the construction trailer, our greatest challenge was to decide on our collective decision-making process. So in my community, we use a modified version of consensus, which means we don't vote, but rather we keep working until we've found a solution that works for everyone. We value the process over efficiency, but yes, it can be grueling at times. The conversation was lengthy, it was deliberative, and it was very emotional, and yet, doesn't that reflect what community asks of us?
Again, in the show notes, there is some guidance on this topic, but people who have been through it comment that getting group consensus around these critical foundational objectives is going to take a lot of time, it is going to take a lot of negotiation, and it will need amendment as experience with your community is gained.
We had this plot of land that we held in a community land trust, and we made decisions by consensus and had 6 ecological covenants. And other than that, everything had to be decided.
We've sort of stepped out of the pioneering phase now, and we're more in the maintaining and growing. And how do we stay true to the values that brought us here while we get bigger, and while the thing that we're here for is becoming so much more accepted in the mainstream.
Once you've formed and set up your community, you still need to learn how to live together. Over and over in every piece of research I've done, people talk about how the flip side of the social benefit is difficulties in maintaining these inevitably close relationships.
When you live with all these people, like, their true insides come out. When you live in Babylon, you wake up and you spend time putting on the mask that you're going to walk out into the world with, and you choose when you interact with people and what part of you that they're going to see, and you don't get that here.
This lifestyle really isn't for everybody. Because I don't think most people would consider the sacrifices they would have to make worth the benefits of those sacrifices, or they don't want to make that trade-off. And we see that here all the time. Cooperation sounds easy until you don't get what you want. Then it doesn't sound so easy anymore.
Every single one of us carries with us a huge pile of baggage, both from family of origin, cultural indoctrination, and the habits of a lifetime. There is one commonality in all of this baggage. Very few of us have ever lived in an intentional community. As a result, we will struggle. We will make damaging mistakes and sometimes undermine our community building efforts. This isn't only a political process or a legal process, it ends up being also a deeply personal process. And if successful, a transformative one.
All of the emotional damage that modern day capitalism does to people is like, it's not gone here. It's not. There's definitely as much healing here as you can push, there's as much healing as you will allow yourself to heal.
I think living here that has been most beneficial for me that I doubt I would have experienced living elsewhere is the challenge that the people around me present to become a better person. And so personal growth work has been a really valuable piece of living here at Dancing Rabbit for me, that I think before I came here, I was pretty sure I was perfect. Like I knew exactly what was going on, and everyone else was wrong. And so I feel like I've come a long way, and the only reason I've done that is with the help and the proximity of so many other people that are interested in thinking about those things in the same way.
Prepare resources, prepare energy, and prepare patience before embarking on this path. Prepare for physical and financial hardships. People who have successfully completed a project like this one all comment that it was very hard at first. It was uncomfortable. Not everyone who starts on the path completes the path.
It's become so civilized here now. I mean, it used to be kind of like wild, but we were all a lot younger and there was a lot more work to do. Dancing Rabbit at the time, everybody was staying in a double wide trailer across the road. The land had been purchased, but it was winter and nothing had been built. One of the buildings had been started, but that was about all that had gotten done. You know, crammed in with a shoehorn with everyone else. I think there were 8 of us there at the time. We were over here on the land as much as we could be. We used the pole barn, we turned it into an outdoor kitchen. We had an old-fashioned wood-fired cook stove. It was really challenging at first, learning to cook vegan for 35 people with whole foods on a wood-burning cook stove. It was also really empowering because once one learned how to do that, I kind of felt like I could do anything.
Is dropping out of a flawed society really a solution? I'm not going to commit to my answer to this question. I will say, so far, I think that this small community idea has a tremendous amount of merit. Capitalism is an unbelievably robust system. Its superpower is an ability to undermine and digest competing systems. But it has a weakness. It needs our participation. It needs our labor in production, and most importantly, it needs our consumption. We are necessary cogs in the machine.
I think the most effective thing, any average person can do is just to say, I'm not going to participate anymore and unplug, which is what I've tried to do. I mean, we're just, to be clear, we're very much still plugged into the system. We run a multi-million-dollar business to support ourselves, but at the same time, we live below the poverty line. We grow a lot of our own food. We're far more self-sufficient than most, and we still enjoy a good quality of life, which I think is important.
As a result, every time you work to benefit yourself directly, every time you labor for someone else for free, every time you feed yourself from your own garden, every time you make something rather than buying it, every time you choose to share rather than to sell, you are rebelling against the system, and you are withdrawing the system's lifeblood.
We've also opted out of each owning our own lawnmower, or bike pump, or bread maker, and instead we share these things with our neighbors. We fight against consumerism and waste while reducing the cognitive overhead of having too much stuff. We support each other. We drive each other to doctor's visits, share old family recipes, and fix broken computers.
Every non-financial life-sustaining act lowers the GDP of your country and frightens the central bankers. Community self-funding without borrowing undermines the borrowing-dependent financial system. Cooperation undermines cash circulation, and reduces the size of the free market. Increasing independence of village members, the power in forming groups, reduces dependence on employers. Village mutual support reduces the need to purchase medical, health, and other capitalist services.
Each adult member of the community has a labor obligation that's 42 hours a week. And in exchange for doing those 42 hours, the community covers basically all the costs of living. If all of your medical and your clothing and your housing and your food and insurance and entertainment and transportation, and basically all of the costs that you have. So most of the members who live here in most days don't actually handle any money. This is extremely unusual for the United States. Almost everybody in the country who's an adult handles money almost every day, and almost everybody who's here almost every day doesn't. There are basically no significant scale hammocks production facilities in the United States except for us. And the way that we're able to do that is that we don't have any managers that we're paying $50,000 or $100,000 a year for. And so that's why it's possible for a workers' cooperative to compete with globalized industries in other countries, because we don't have this capitalist overhead of the very expensive managers on top of us.
Even a nearly self-sufficient community will have to trade at some level within a wider capitalist economy. It will have to pay something in taxes to support current governance, but reduces the total of each of these contributions massively. This act won't cause overnight collapse of the existing system, but each community is a nail in the system's coffin. Why it isn't enough. As it stands, intentional communities aren't a revolutionary solution to our problems. Despite having existed as a concept for many decades, and in practice for as long as humans have existed, intentional communities are not growing at anywhere near the rate needed to change the world. The New York Times says they are, quote, proliferating, unquote, but I can't find any figures to corroborate that report. For community living of this type to have an effect on the world, they would need to become much more prominent, much more popular, and much more politically influential. This alternative needs active promotion, one that battles stereotypes and promotes it as an attractive option. This has begun. It wasn't hard for me to do basic research, but it still required going through a lot of only tangentially relevant material, and some of the sites were less professional or complete. Promotion and public relations would be a good step in the right direction. If this is to work, it has to be seen as viable, realistic, and something to be proud of. Psst! Hit the like on this video. I'm trying to preach here. Appropriate and supportive regulation would also be super helpful. First, it gives intentional groups access to the legal system when needed. Secondly, it creates a sense of legality and the appearance of tacit social acceptance as a viable life choice. This requires political organization and action. It requires some critical mass of groups fighting for recognition and able to be big enough to exert political influence. Ultimately, there are some human needs and human rights that can't be protected by these small, isolated communities. Obviously, small black communities weren't safe when the majority white community around them were hostile. How about Jewish communities in Europe in the 1930s? A system of association and common cause formed across communities as recommended by Illich seems one way forward. He discusses a federal structure that allows for the ensuring of justice across communities. Bringing communities into some sort of association, maybe a formal one, allows for multiplying of power. There also has been some experimental communities in the past that have gone spectacularly wrong. Jonestown pops to mind. Now, a cult isn't what I mean when I use the term intentional living, But it is possible for a small community, especially one that becomes highly isolated from the outside world, to go bad. Again, a system of association might provide mechanisms to allow for individuals to be protected within chosen communities. But effective structures of this type don't exist, and I can't imagine a good outcome from using existing authority, like police forces, to intervene in the community. It might work well, or it might turn out like Waco. It is the work of turning this movement into a significant influence in our society that really needs to be done. I'm trying to add my own voice and perhaps a suggested theoretical structure to this movement. Obviously, I don't know enough or have any practical experience that allows me to be completely convinced of the potential of these communities. But so far, I'm fascinated and very influenced. So this is my current and my best attempt at this point of answering the question of what I would recommend that we do as a way to fight back against the current system. I mean, the current system isn't that hard to understand. The current system doesn't concern itself with the individual except in a few horrible ways. The system exists to exploit our ability to generate profit, to sell our labor, and to consume its goods. The only way out is to either destroy the system or to drop out of it. Destroy doesn't seem practical at this current point. So that leaves drop out as really the only feasible way to move forward. Luckily, every penny not earned and every penny not spent is an act of sabotage. It is an act of defiance and of subversion. To make this rebellion really count, though, we need to combine our efforts into some kind of bigger organization, and international communities seem to fit this objective. But this movement can't achieve any influence or drive change without exploding in size and in reputation. I'd invite my fellow skeptics to do your own research and give it some thought. At least I can promise you a brief reprieve from sitting powerless and watching our world as it burns. I know I'm going to keep looking at the topic and will share with you anything interesting that I find. If you enjoyed this video, please take the time to like and subscribe. This is XCG, wishing you rapid progress on your journey to freedom.